At 22:30 on a May night in 1945, the top of the Maeda Escarpment on Okinawa looked less like a battlefield and more like a scrap heap of men. Broken rifles, shredded packs, bodies that hadn't moved in hours. In the middle of that wreckage, one thin figure in a medic's helmet knelt beside a man who was still breathing. He had no rifle, no sidearm, not even a bayonet. Just a medical bag, a length of rope, and a prayer he kept repeating under his breath. His name was Desmond Doss, combat medic of the 77th Infantry Division. The army had called him a conscientious objector. Some of the men called him something shorter and meaner, a coward without a gun. But on that ridge, with Japanese soldiers still hiding in the darkness only yards away, it was the coward who stayed behind when the shooting stopped and everyone else went back down the cliff. Officially, the army would later credit Desmond Doss with saving 75 wounded men on Okinawa. Most of that number came from this one night on the Maeda Escarpment. On the chunk of high ground, the men of the 77th had started calling Hacksaw Ridge. 75 men lowered over the edge, one at a time, by a medic who refused to pick up a weapon in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. There was no system, no pulley, no squad of helpers, just Doss dragging one broken body at a time to the lip of the escarpment, rigging a rough sling out of rope and straps, and easing them over into the blackness while machine gun tracers stitched the air above him. Under his breath, over and over, he said the same quiet sentence, "Lord, help me get just one more." Every trip into the darkness meant crawling past craters and corpses the Japanese had already ranged with mortars. Every time he stood up to move, he knew one careless silhouette against the sky could end the whole effort with a single burst. To the men down below, it felt impossible that a single unarmed medic could bring back 75 lives off that killing ground, up on top. Doss wasn't thinking about records, or citations, or history. He was thinking about the next man he hadn't found yet, and the fact that when dawn came, this ridge would still belong to the enemy. If you want to see how a man the army almost threw out for refusing to carry a rifle ended up saving 75 of its own in one night, you can tap like and subscribe to WW2 Echo Stories. It helps push these real World War II accounts to more people who have only ever seen the movie version of Hacksaw Ridge. And it tells the algorithm that stories like Desmond Doss's are still worth hearing. Because nights like this don't start on top of a ridge, they start years earlier, in places that look nothing like a battlefield. Desmond Doss grew up a long way from Okinawa, in the mill town of Lynchburg, Virginia. His father was a World War I veteran who brought home more scars than stories and drank too much, trying to quiet both. Fights in the Doss house were loud, sudden, and sometimes ugly. One night, as a teenager, Desmond picked up a gun in anger during a family argument and realized how close he had come to pulling the trigger. The shock of that moment never left him. On the bedroom wall of the Doss home hung a framed print of the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer. Desmond would stare at the words, "Thou shalt not kill," and measure them against what he saw outside boys his age going off to fight. Men coming back, changed or not coming back at all. He made a private decision that for him, those words were literal. He would wear a uniform if his country asked. He would not take a life. When Japan hit Pearl Harbor, Doss didn't run from the draft. He walked into it and asked for the one job that fit his rule combat medic. By the time Desmond Doss set foot on Okinawa in April 1945, the Pacific War had already chewed through 4 years of men and steel. But Okinawa was different. It wasn't just another island on a map. It was the last stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. Every American officer who looked at the charts understood what that meant if Okinawa turned into a bloodbath. An invasion of Japan itself would be worse. The orders going down the chain were simple and cold. Take the island, no matter how many men it costs. The Japanese defenders had read the same terrain. They knew they could not match American industry in the air or at sea, so they buried themselves in the rock. Instead of trying to throw the Americans back into the water, they built layered defenses along the southern third of the island. Around a line anchored on the old royal capital of Shuri, concrete pillboxes were poured into the sides of hills. Caves were linked by tunnels, with firing ports cut into cliffs that looked empty from a distance. Artillery was pulled back behind ridges, firing over the heads of the front line and then disappearing into underground galleries. On the maps, one section of that line looked almost like a neat contour mark, a steep rise of ground running east-west, about 400 feet above sea level. On the ground. It was a cliff. The Americans called it the Maeda Escarpment, to the infantry who had to climb it under fire. The name that stuck was shorter and more honest Hacksaw Ridge. The only way onto the plateau was up nets and ropes that hung down the face. Once a man's boots left the ground, he was exposed. A moving silhouette against the sky with nothing to hide behind and nowhere to go but up or down. The 1st Regiment sent against the escarpment learned that the hard way. Units from the 96th Infantry Division made the initial assaults. They climbed, fought their way onto the top, and ran straight into a maze of Japanese firing points they could not see until the shooting started. Machine guns were sighted to rake the flat ground where the nets came up. Mortars were pre-registered on likely rally points. When the Americans dug shallow foxholes, Japanese soldiers emerged from caves behind them at night, throwing grenades into holes that had looked safe at dusk. Companies that reported taking an objective in the afternoon reported being driven off it by nightfall. The casualty reports were ugly reading. Companies went up at half strength and came down with barely a platoon. Men were hit in the first seconds on the nets, falling backward into those climbing behind them. Wounded who made it to the top found that going back down was almost worse. There was no protected route for evacuation. A medic trying to drag a man to the edge and lower him by rope had to stand up, show himself against the skyline, and work in the open long enough for a machine gun crew to walk their fire onto him. The simple math of exposure and time worked against anyone who tried. Into this environment walked the 77th Infantry Division. They had already fought on Guam and Leyte. They knew what jungle, artillery, and close-quarter fighting looked like. What many of them had never seen was a man like Desmond Doss. He had already earned a reputation inside his own regiment long before anyone had heard the words Hacksaw Ridge. It was not a flattering one. Word spread during training that there was a soldier in the 77th who refused to touch a rifle, in a combat division, at the end of a long war. That sounded less like conscience and more like a liability. The army had a term for men who entered the service but objected to killing conscientious objectors. Some were given non-combatant roles far from the front. Doss was different. He insisted on serving in a frontline infantry unit as a medic, but he just as firmly insisted he would never carry a weapon. To officers trying to mold a rifle company into something that could survive its first contact with the Japanese, that was a problem, not a philosophical discussion. A man who would not pick up a gun took up a place on a transport, in a foxhole, on a ration list, and in the casualty figures just like anyone else. His fellow soldiers reacted the way hard men often do to something they don't understand. They mocked him on the parade ground for reading his Bible at night. They questioned whether they could trust a man who would not stand shoulder to shoulder with them behind a rifle. Fists flew in dark barracks. At one point, an officer tried to push him out through charges and a court-martial rather than carry the responsibility of taking an unarmed man into combat. Doss did not change his mind. He also did not change his assignment. After hearings and paperwork that never make it into recruiting posters, the Army confirmed his status as a non-combatant medic and ordered him forward with his company anyway. On paper, that solved the regulation problem. On the ground, it did nothing to solve the tactical one. The 77th was being sent into some of the most concentrated defensive fire of the entire Pacific War. Casualty predictions for the assaults along the Shuri line were high before the first boot hit the sand. Every rifleman was expected to carry his own weight in attack and defense. Every medic was expected to move under fire, patch men up fast, and get them off the line alive when possible. The idea that one of those medics would do all of that without the option of firing a shot back did not inspire confidence. Then the division's orders changed from map lines to coordinates. The 77th would be committed against the Maeda Escarpment. They would climb the same nets, onto the same plateau that had already eaten so many men from other units. Officers studied aerial photographs and contour lines, trying to find a way to take the ridge without throwing their battalions into the same meat grinder. None of the arrows on the map solved the same problem once men were on top. Once they were hit and lying in the open, there was still no safe way to get them back down. That was the battlefield Desmond Doss walked into. A campaign where the planners expected heavy losses, a piece of ground that punished any man who showed himself, and a unit that had not yet decided if the unarmed medic in their ranks was an asset or a mistake. The army's problem on Okinawa was how to break a fortified line without breaking its own infantry beyond repair. Doss's problem was smaller, but just as blunt. How do you keep your promise not to kill in a place designed to make killing the only thing that matters, long before Okinawa? Desmond Doss had already answered the question most men hoped they would never face. What do you do when someone is bleeding out in the open and the next step toward them might be your last? His answer had been the same on Guam and Leyte. You move anyway. On Guam, he had sprinted ahead of the line to reach a man pinned down in a shell hole, using nothing more than a smoke grenade and the fact that the Japanese gunners were busy with bigger targets. On Leyte, he had dragged wounded men out of rice paddies under machine gun fire, using their bodies and his own as moving cover. Each time, he came back with someone who would otherwise have died where they fell. Each time, the men who watched him started to adjust their language. Coward was a harder word to say after you had seen him run toward fire while you were hugging the dirt. But the fundamentals never changed. Doss still refused to pick up a rifle. He still would not even touch one during weapons inspections. He did not argue tactics with officers or preach at the men around him. He just held to a simple rule in his head: if a man was alive and reachable, he had an obligation to try, if he died doing it. That was his problem, not theirs. Okinawa sharpened that rule. On the approaches to the Maeda Escarpment, Doss saw a new kind of problem. Men were not just being hit in front of a line that could fall back and pull them in. They were being hit on ground that was exposed in every direction, sometimes within sight of the cliff edge and the nets. Getting to them was one issue, getting them off the plateau was another. A wounded man could not climb down a cargo net. A medic could not carry him down on his back without both of them becoming easy targets. If there was to be any hope of dragging men off Hacksaw Ridge alive, someone would have to figure out a way to lower them over the side. Doss did not have access to engineers or equipment. What he did have were his hands. A coil of rope, and habits formed long before he put on a uniform. As a boy in Virginia, he had learned knots and rigging, helping with odd jobs, and watching men work in the shipyards at Newport News. The details were not glamorous. How to take the strain off a line, how to tie a hitch that would hold underweight but still release when needed, how to improvise when you did not have the right hardware. On Okinawa, away from the worst of the fire, he practiced those skills with a specific purpose. Using web belts, sling straps, and standard-issue rope. He worked out a way to cinch a wounded man's torso and legs into a makeshift harness that would not slip even if the man passed out. He tested how quickly he could tie it. He tested how much weight he could control over a drop, paying out the rope hand over hand without burning his palms raw. There was no manual for what he was doing. Regulations covered proper litter evacuation along marked trails. They did not cover lowering a full-grown rifleman down a vertical escarpment in the dark with enemy rifles looking for movement. The crazy part was not the rigging. Any competent rigger could have worked out a similar system given time and tools. The crazy part was the assumption built into Doss's quiet rehearsals there would come a moment when he would be alone on top, with wounded around him and no one else left standing long enough to help. He never said that out loud. He did not advertise a plan to stay when others left. But in his mind, the decision was already made. If the order came to pull back from the ridge and there were still men alive up there, he would not go. There was no dramatic conversation about it. No scene where he announced his intentions to a skeptical captain. The army had already told him what it expected: move forward with your company. Treat the wounded you can reach. Come back when ordered to do so. Doss listened, saluted, and walked out with the same quiet calculation he had carried since basic training. He knew what the regulations said. He knew what his conscience said. If the two diverged on a dark night at the top of a cliff, he knew which one he would follow. When the 77th received final orders to assault the Maeda Escarpment, platoon leaders briefed their men on fields of fire, sectors of advance, and rally points. They talked about Japanese machine gun positions, likely mortar zones, and how to keep moving once their boots left the nets and hit the plateau. No one gave a briefing on rope work. No one mentioned what to do if the ridge turned into a dead end with no way to evacuate casualties. That part of the operation existed only in the head of one unarmed medic, walking toward the base of the cliff with a coil of rope packed next to bandages and morphine. On the morning, the 77th Infantry Division went up Hacksaw Ridge. The plan looked simple on paper. Artillery would pound the top of the escarpment and the reverse slope for hours. Naval guns off the coast would walk their fire along suspected cave mouths and concrete positions. When the barrage lifted, infantry companies would climb the cargo nets, fan out on the plateau, and push the Japanese back from the edge far enough to dig in for the night. The maps showed arrows and phase lines. The escarpment itself, rising like a wall of grey-brown stone and clay, did not care. At the base of the cliff, soldiers of the 77th clipped bayonets onto rifles, checked magazines, and took their places at the nets. Marines and soldiers from divisions that had already tried the climb moved among them, offering quiet advice that sounded more like warnings. Don't bunch up on the nets. Don't stop at the top. Don't assume a cave is empty just because it looks dark. Above them, the bombardment rolled and cracked like a storm trapped inside the rock. Desmond Doss stood in the same line as everyone else, helmet low over his glasses, aid bag slung across his shoulder, coil of rope packed inside. He had no rifle to check. He patted morphine syrettes and bandage packets instead. Around him, some men muttered short prayers. Others stared straight up at the frayed ends of rope whipping gently in the wind. No one asked him, in that moment, why his hands were empty. They all knew he would be busy soon enough. When the guns finally fell silent, the absence of noise felt louder than the barrage. A whistle blew. Men stepped forward, grabbed the nets, and began to climb. Boots went up into another man's face. Packs snagged on knots. Someone slipped, cursed, and pulled himself back into line. Halfway up, there was nothing to do but keep moving hand over hand and hope that any Japanese soldier still alive above was too stunned or buried to shoot straight. Doss climbed with them, feeling the ropes sway under the combined weight of the company. The air smelled of cordite and pulverized earth. Dust drifted down from the lip of the escarpment as blasts settled and fragments of rock broke free. When his helmet finally cleared the edge, he did what doctrine said every infantryman should do, He rolled off the net and moved. Drop, left, low. Get away from the obvious killing zone. The top of the escarpment was not flat. It was a churned-up mix of shallow craters, broken tree stumps, and low scrub, pocked with darker holes that might have been old shell impacts or might have been cave mouths. Men scrambled forward, trying to put at least 50, then 100 yards between themselves and the place where more bodies would appear over the lip. For a few minutes, the only movement was American. Then the plateau answered. Machine guns opened from positions that had survived the bombardment, their crews protected behind logs and rock. Shots came not from a neat line across the front, but from angles left, right, even from behind low rises that looked like they should have been clean. Mortar shells began to drop, walking back and forth across likely assembly areas. The Japanese had been here long enough to know exactly where men would run when the shooting started. The plateau that had seemed open a moment before turned into a maze of invisible lines of fire. Within seconds, Doss's work began. A man 3 paces in front of him snapped backward as a bullet hit, his helmet spinning away. Doss dropped into a shallow depression, then crawled forward on elbows and knees until he could reach the wounded soldier's ankle. He tugged, inching the man back into what little cover there was, ignoring the impact of dirt kicked into his face by rounds hitting near. Hands practiced from Guam and Leyte moved without wasted motion. Bandage on, bleeding checked, airway cleared, quick shot of morphine. Tag on the collar. Across the plateau. The pattern repeated. Men lunged forward, got hit, and lay where they fell unless someone reached them. Doss moved toward the sound of calls for medic as if pulled by a rope. He slid into shell scrapes, pressed his body in front of others to take the line of fire for a few seconds while a man caught his breath, and then moved on. He had no weapon to fire back with. His presence did not reduce the volume of enemy fire. It only changed what happened to the men the fire found. For several hours, the assault held. Small groups from the 77th pushed deeper into the Japanese positions, clearing caves with grenades and satchel charges, bayoneting men who rushed them from spider holes. Each cleared pocket left behind more wounded. Doss worked backward and sideways from the forward line, pulling men toward the relative safety of the area near the edge. At first, evacuation was improvised. 2 men would grab a casualty under the arms and drag him. Stumbling and swearing, toward the cliff where litter teams tried to organize some kind of path down. The Japanese did not accept the American timetable. When they judged enough of the attacking force had reached the plateau, they launched what they did best on Okinawa, a counterattack designed to shred an exposed unit in place. Mortars thickened. Shells pounded the lip of the escarpment, the one place every man would have to cross if he wanted to go back down, from caves and trenches that had stayed quiet through the first wave of fighting. Fresh riflemen and machine gun crews emerged, pouring fire into the Americans who had thought they were pushing into a retreating enemy. The line bent, then buckled. Fire came from directions that had been safe minutes earlier. Men who had been moving forward toward an objective found themselves suddenly cut off. Taking fire from both flanks, platoon leaders shouting orders realized they could no longer see half their squads. The radios crackled with fragmentary reports. "We're getting flanked. We're taking it from the rear," and then went dead. Near the escarpment edge. The situation turned to chaos. Wounded men lay 2 and 3 deep in places where Doss and other medics had pulled them. Incoming fire began to walk toward those clusters. A mortar round landed close enough to lift Doss off his feet and drop him back in a rain of dirt and metal. When he could hear again, through the ringing, he realized the shouting around him had changed tone. It was no longer forward. It was pull back. The order to withdraw came down through whatever officers and NCOs were still standing fall back to the cliff. Get over the edge. Live to attack again. There was no orderly. Phased retreat. Men grabbed rifles, grabbed wounded if they could, and ran. Some slid on their backsides toward the nets, others simply jumped for the rope, boots scrabbling for purchase as they tried to get some part of their weight onto the strands and out of the immediate killing zone. Doss did not head for the nets. He moved in the opposite direction, toward the nearest man who was not moving under his own power. He dragged one casualty, then another. Toward the edge, as the stream of retreating soldiers thinned from a flood to a trickle, for a few precious minutes. There were still hands to help him. A pair of riflemen dropped their weapons long enough to hoist a wounded sergeant between them and hand him over to a litter team waiting at the lip. Then they vanished over the side themselves. The ground grew quieter around Doss, but not in a way that meant safety. Machine guns still snapped from the tree line, mortars still thumped. What changed was the sound of American voices. A minute ago, there had been dozens orders, curses, prayers. Now there were mostly groans and the occasional hoarse shout for a medic from deeper in the plateau. At the edge. The last organized group of men was already going down. Someone yelled that anybody still alive up top needed to move now or be left. Doss looked at the men lying on the ground between him and the smoke-thick middle distance of the ridge. He looked at the nets, where figures were shrinking as they descended. Then he made the decision he had been rehearsing in his head without words since he first tied a knot in the rope. He turned his back on the way down. Instead of grabbing the net, he grabbed the nearest wounded man under the shoulders and began to pull him away from the edge, back toward a shallow depression where he might be out of direct line of fire long enough to be treated and moved later. The man was heavy, limp with shock. Every foot of ground cost seconds, and every second on that plateau was one more chance for a stray shell fragment or bullet to end them both. By the time Doss had finished dragging that first man to cover and working his hands over the worst of the bleeding, the noise from the cliff edge had changed again. The clatter of gear on rope had faded. The only clear sounds now were Japanese voices in the distance, the occasional sharp crack of a rifle, and the labored breathing of men who were still alive for the moment. The top of Hacksaw Ridge was no longer a battlefield. It was a killing ground that one side had temporarily abandoned and the other still occupied, in the middle of it. One medic with no weapon and a coil of rope understood that he was, for all practical purposes, alone. When the last boots of the 77th disappeared over the edge of Hacksaw Ridge, the battlefield did what battlefields always do after an assault collapses. It went quiet in the loudest possible way. No shouted orders, no coordinated volleys, just the random, ugly sounds that follow a failed attack, the cough of a single rifle, the thump of a delayed mortar round, the low animal noises of men trying not to scream. Somewhere in that dark, Desmond Doss knelt beside the man he had just dragged into a shallow scrape and made a calculation. The plateau was roughly the size of a few football fields laid side by side. The nets were at one end. The Japanese held positions scattered all over the rest. Between those two facts lay dozens of Americans who had been hit and left where they fell when the pullback order came. The choice looked simple. Either he moved toward them, or he pretended he hadn't heard them at all. He tightened the last bandage, whispered something no one else would hear, and started crawling back toward the sounds. Phase 2 of the fight for Hacksaw was no longer about ground. The line had already snapped. There would be no second push that night. For Doss, the battle had turned into a loop find. Treat, move, lower, repeat. The only variable was how long he could keep that loop going before either the Japanese found him or his body quit. He moved low, never silhouetting himself against the sky if he could help it, in the scattered light of flares and burning debris. The plateau turned into a series of short dashes and long crawls. He would stop, listen for the thin edge of a human voice under the background noise, then angle toward it. Sometimes it was a clear shout of medic, sometimes it was just a wet rattle from a crater that looked empty until he slid into it and put a hand on a shoulder. Each time he reached a man who was still alive. The sequence was the same. Stop the worst of the bleeding. Splint what could be splinted quickly. Decide whether morphine would keep the man quiet or leave him too fogged to help his own rescue. Then the hard part, get him to the edge. In daylight. Evacuation was a team job, 2 or 4 men on a litter, trading off as their arms tired. On that night, team meant 1. Doss would grab a man under the armpits or by the webbing of his harness and drag him backward, inch by inch, toward the escarpment. The ground that had seemed rough under boots became a series of obstacles when you were pulling 150 to 200 pounds of dead weight. Boots caught on roots, equipment snagged. Every time his shoulders screamed, he shifted grip and kept moving. Once at the edge, the rope work began. He would roll the casualty onto his side long enough to snake loops under the torso and legs, cinching them tight with quick knots. Then he'd ease the man over until gravity took some of the load and the full weight came onto the rope in his hands. There was no belay device, no second set of palms to share the burn, just friction across the lip of the ridge and the muscles in his forearms. Some accounts later tried to assign an exact number of minutes to each casualty. The truth is, Doss never worked with a stopwatch. He worked with feel. A few seconds to get the balance right. A minute or 2 of controlled descent. Enough slack at the end that whoever was still down below could grab the man and pull him clear, then haul the rope back up, wrap it so it wouldn't snarl, and turn back toward the darkness for the next one. The Japanese were not blind. They had to know that the Americans had left men behind. They had patrols of their own moving among the bodies, looking for wounded who might still be dangerous or pretending to be dead, more than once. Doss heard voices speaking Japanese uncomfortably close. He froze, pressed into the dirt next to a casualty, heartbeat loud in his own ears. There were stories after the war that he treated a wounded Japanese soldier that night as well, binding a sucking chest wound and leaving the man propped against a stump instead of finishing him. Doss never made a point of telling that version. It fit his pattern. He drew one line, alive or dead. Uniform color didn't enter into it. As the hours went by, fatigue took on a physical shape. His hands swelled. The rope dug grooves into the soft parts between thumb and palm. Sweat soaked his uniform and chilled in the night air every time he stopped moving. He had to fight the urge to lie still just for a minute. Every pause risked turning into the moment his body decided that was enough. The men down below started to understand something was happening long before the count reached any impressive number. At first, they thought someone up top had found a surviving litter team. A stretcher would appear over the edge, or a body would swing into view on a rope. Then the pattern established itself. Another came. And another. Some broken. Some still conscious enough to talk as they were lowered. They all told the same story. It's Doss. He's still up there. Officers at the base of the ridge looked up into the darkness and realized that the evacuation they were watching didn't fit the expected profile. There had been no organized plan to leave a squad in place. No orders issued to hold a perimeter overnight. Whoever was sending men down was doing it on his own. Hours bled together, on the plateau. Doss fell into a rhythm that only broke when conditions forced him to improvise. One man had a shattered leg that couldn't take the strain of being dragged. Doss took the extra time to fashion a crude sled from a broken stretcher pole and a torn shelter half, pulling the man on canvas instead of bare ground. Another had a belly wound so bad that any rough movement might have finished him. Doss crawled back and forth twice to bring bandages and sulfur powder from his kit, working by feel to keep the man stable enough to move. Each success bought more time for someone else. Each trip also increased the odds that a random shell fragment or bullet would erase the whole effort. That balance between progress and risk never left his head. It simply never tipped far enough to one side for him to stop. By the time a grey smear of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Doss had lost track of how many men he had touched. The rope felt heavier. The plateau felt bigger. What he hadn't lost was the sentence he kept repeating under his breath whenever he finished one descent and turned to look for the next shape on the ground. Lord, please help me get one more. Eventually. There were no more voices to follow. He swept the ground he could reach one last time, checking craters and holes that had already cost him sweat and skin earlier in the night. When he was finally convinced that anyone left was beyond his help, he gathered what remained of his supplies and made his way to the nets. The immediate aftermath, from the American side, began with a head count that didn't add up. Units that had reported catastrophic losses the night before found more names present on the morning roll than they expected. Men who should have been written off as missing or presumed dead were instead being loaded onto jeeps and litter trucks, tagged seriously wounded, but alive. Word of how that happened moved up the chain quickly. Company-grade officers reported what their men told them. Battalion wrote it into their logs, somewhere between the battalion aid station and division headquarters. The number began to stabilize around a figure that sounded almost unreal: 75. 75 wounded evacuated from the top of Hacksaw Ridge, most in a single night, by one medic who refused to carry a weapon. Among the rank and file. The math was simpler. They knew who had gone up unarmed. They knew who had stayed when they were ordered to fall back. The same soldiers who had once avoided sharing a foxhole with Doss because he won't even pick up a gun found themselves using different words. Some simply called him Doc. Others started sentences with, "If it hadn't been for Doss," and then stopped, because the end of that sentence was obvious. Okinawa did not pause to celebrate. After that night, the 77th still had work to do. Doss kept doing his, moving with his company in later attacks until the odds finally caught up with him. He was wounded by shrapnel in one assault, refused evacuation, and treated other men first. Days later, he stepped on a grenade, threw himself on it to shield those around him, and sent away the stretcher that came for him so that another casualty could ride instead. Even on the litter he eventually accepted. He insisted on fashioning a splint out of a rifle stock for his own shattered arm so that he could keep his hand free for another man's needs. Those later actions would help fill the commendation paperwork. They would round out the picture for officers whose job it was to justify medals and citations. But for the men who had been on Hacksaw Ridge that night, the verdict was already in. Whatever they had once thought about the unarmed medic from Virginia, one fact overrode the rest. When everything went wrong on top of that cliff, and everyone else was ordered to leave, he stayed. In the months after Okinawa, the U.S. Army did something it rarely did for a man who had never fired a shot at the enemy. It wrote his name into the very top line of its honor roll. On October the 12th, 1945, in a ceremony on the White House lawn, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around the neck of Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss. The citation ran longer than most. It had to. It covered Guam, it covered Leyte, it covered the grenade he had smothered with his own body and the litter ride he had given up to another man. But in the middle of all the formal language about gallantry and conspicuous bravery, one phrase stood out: 75 wounded, evacuated from an escarpment under fire on Okinawa. Truman shook Doss's hand and told him, privately, that he considered the medal harder to earn than the presidency itself. Doss, uncomfortable in dress uniform and bright sunlight, looked like a man waiting for the moment he could go home. He had done his job. He had kept his promise. The rest, as far as he was concerned, belonged to the men who made speeches for a living. The years after the war were not easy. The damage to his lungs from battlefield infections and injuries never fully healed. The quiet mill-town boy from Lynchburg spent long stretches in hospitals and lived modestly when he was out. He did not tour the country as a professional hero. He did not make a career out of his medal. When people asked him how he had done what he did on Hacksaw Ridge, his answer stayed the same: one more man at a time. The lesson his story leaves behind is not complicated, but it cuts against the way most war stories are told. Courage is usually measured in rounds fired, enemies killed, ground taken. Doss's record runs in the opposite direction: no trigger pulled, no confirmed kills. But 75 men who made it off a cliff alive because one soldier refused to stand up for himself and refused to lie down on them. That's the kind of story we try to keep alive here. If you want more true World War II accounts like this, stories of people, history almost left out, consider subscribing to WW2 Echo Stories so you don't miss the next one. And in the comments, tell us this: if you had been in Doss's company before Okinawa, what would you honestly have thought about a medic who walked into combat without a gun, and would that opinion have changed after Hacksaw Ridge? Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping make sure men like Desmond Doss are not swept away in the current of history.